How would you describe your cultural background? Each of us has a culture, whether we're aware of it or not. Actually, it's probably more accurate to say each of us lives in multiple cultures. It might be your church culture, your home culture, your work culture. In order to gain a better as we gain a better understanding of our own cultures, we are also better able to understand other people's cultures. And so what I'd like to do is set forth several categories of cultural analysis that you can use to understand your own culture as you prepare for an assignment coming up. And also then it'll help you to think through other people's cultures and how your cultures intersect. So let me jump in and set forth a few different categories. The first category I want to talk about is the category of risk. There are kind of two ends of the spectrum with risk: the high risk culture and a low risk culture, and then multiple variations in between. Imagine that you're going on a 2-week vacation to Central America. What's your preference? Would you prefer to have all the arrangements made in advance and all the hotels booked and know all the bus routes and know where you're going to eat every meal? Or would you prefer to just go and figure it out on the way? Do you prefer to have things kind of open-ended, or do you prefer to have it pretty well settled? Those are examples of how this risk value plays out, maybe for you, and it varies in terms of national cultures as well. Some cultures as a whole tend to be more open to risk, and some tend to more want to minimize risk. So that's high risk, low risk distinction. A low risk culture is one that avoids ambiguity and uncertainty. There's an emphasis on safety. Order is prized, self-discipline is prized. Low risk cultures are uncomfortable with novel or new situations. An example would be if you go to a park and you see children playing on the playground equipment. People from low-risk cultures will tend to be stay much closer to their children, and they'll want to make sure that the children don't take any risks that might get a scrape or something like that. People from a high-risk culture at a playground might be more likely to let their children try it out, and hey, if they fall 4 feet, yeah, they might get hurt, but they're going to be okay. The risk isn't that scary to them. But back to the low-risk culture, somebody from a low-risk culture would be more likely to go to a foreign country and find a chain restaurant. So you go to a foreign country and, oh, there's a McDonald's or there's a Kentucky Fried Chicken, and they'll eat at that restaurant because they know what to get. They know what the menu is going to be. It's predictable. There's not a risk involved. You know what's coming. Low risk would also be played out in worship services where you want every detail planned. You don't want any uncertainty. Now, high-risk culture is more comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. Unpredictability is actually welcomed, perhaps, in a high-risk culture. If you are more comfortable taking risks, taking a risk, things will just work out, and knowing things are not, and knowing in advance what will happen isn't that important to you, then you are maybe from a higher risk culture. When you go on vacation, if you're in a high risk, if you're shaped by a high risk culture, you have less of an urgency to have all the details figured out. You're willing to take the risk that it'll go as you hope. It'll go as planned. In a foreign country, instead of going to the food chain you probably would be more likely to go to the local dive and take the risk on the local cuisine. You are encouraged, perhaps in school, growing up, to take risks in terms of trying new activities. Hey, you've never played football. Why don't you go out for football? You've never sung in the choir, but they're having auditions. Give it a go. Those are sort of risky things if you're not used to them, and perhaps you've been encouraged to do that. New activities, new experiences. regardless of which one we're from or which variation on the spectrum, we tend to think of our own culture as the norm and judge every other one by it. And we've got to avoid that, because high risk and low risk are not value categories. Although people in low risk cultures will tend to judge negatively the risks that others take, and people in high risk cultures will look down on people that don't take risks. So that's part of why understanding our culture can be helpful. It can neutralize some of those value judgments, and we can understand that there are just some differences in how we see the world. Just to throw out some examples, some low-risk cultures. Japan is a very low-risk culture. Greece is a low-risk culture. One book I was reading labels Jamaica and Sweden as high-risk cultures. I would say the U.S. culture in general is a medium to higher risk, medium high risk sort of culture. Okay, so that's one category that I think can be helpful in analyzing a culture, this category of risk. Is your culture high or low, or somewhere on that spectrum? Second category for analyzing culture has to do with time. And in this overall category of time, there are several subcategories that we can use to understand how people view time or how they live with time. One important aspect of a culture is how it's oriented toward time. Does the culture tend to focus on the past? Does the culture tend to focus on the present? Or does the culture tend to focus on the future? So in a church culture, for example, does the church always look back to its glory years? Is there that past orientation in time, in terms of time? Or does the church focus on what's going on right now? What do we have going in our everyday life as a body right now? That's more of a focus on the present. Or is your church culture more of a visionary culture? Where can we be in 5 years or 10 years? That focus not so much on the present, but on the future. So that time orientation, the past, present, or future, is one way of trying to understand a culture. What was your home culture life like in terms of that? Did your family tell lots of stories about the past? Or was your family always dreaming about the future? What about your ethnic culture? Whether you're Anglo or Asian or African, whatever your ethnic background is, what's the dominant view of time? So